Welcome back, everybody. Another episode of Dynasty Leverage. I know it has been a while. I apologize for that. But I've had this idea for a while to do an episode, and I actually just finished an article series for DLF, Dynasty Leverage. I'm writing a monthly article over there with leverage ideas. People always ask me, what is leverage? What does it mean? How do you define it? And I actually did the first article that dropped right before the NFL draft on DLF that talked about leverage and how I defined it and how I actually put it into play into Dynasty. Today's episode is going to follow that same theme. It's going to be kind of a breakdown of what that article was that'll be dropping tomorrow. But at the same time, I'm going to keep it a little shorter. This is probably going to be only about a 15-minute episode, but it's going to be all about tight ends. And I think the reason I wanted to do a tight end show is because if you look out currently in the dynasty space, fantasy space, I tend to think a lot of tight end analysis is lazy. And that's for two different reasons. One, I think a lot of formats, and I'll get into formatting and where it actually matters, why this leverage video will matter to you depending on your format. Most formats, tight ends do not matter. The data backs that up. And I think a lot of the content creators and a lot of people that are writing and doing shows at big sites probably inherently already know this. They may not know the data behind it, but they know that tight ends really don't matter. And you hear a lot of lazy analysis that goes something like get the best tight end, get an elite tight end, and then punt or wait for the value or stream. Like you hear those breakdowns of how you're going to address the tight end position, whether that's in best ball or dynasty or redraft leagues, whatever. But you hear that analysis a lot, and it doesn't really help you to pick which tight ends are going to quote unquote break out. Which tight ends do I want to stash? If you're in leagues where tight end actually matters, and again, I'll get into that, that's where you probably want to tune into this video. So I think part of it is people just gloss over tight ends because really it doesn't matter if you're just in a standard PPR league where there's 9 starters. Yeah, you probably want to have an elite tight end. If you don't, you can probably find replacement level at the position for super cheap. You can stream, you can find it off the waiver wire, you can pray for a touchdown, you can stack a lesser tight end with a quarterback and make up a lot of the advantages that other teams might have. But the other part of it, I think it's such a complex position that for Dynasty, you don't hear a lot of analysis talking about tight ends. Listen to Devy shows. Oh, we don't care about tight end. You just don't draft tight ends in Devy. Okay, I understand that. Rookies. Well, I'm not going to do a lot of tight end analysis. Look for draft capital, look for athleticism. After that, there's not really a lot of analysis on why, okay, there were, let's say, 15 tight ends taken in a draft. I don't really hear anybody going through and ranking them based on landing spot or based on profile or anything like that. Like you just kind of have people that like their guys and they'll either say I like them or I don't. But there's really not like a lot of analysis where we sit here and we talk about wide receivers and running backs and we go over them over and over and over and over. When it comes to rookies and buys and sells and all this stuff, like you hear a lot of people talking about every position but tight end. So it's a cascading effect. It's because there's a lot of leagues where tight ends don't matter. And then it's a lazy position that people don't want to analyze because you know what? It is not really easy to analyze. That's the other thing. You might have a guy that has X, Y, and Z, but he doesn't do anything for 6 years. And that could be because of the offense. It could be because of the scheme. It could be because of the learning curve that it might take for him to pick up, you know, this playbook. I mean, we don't know. There's a lot of things that I don't think dynasty analysts are able to account for. So they gloss over it. They don't even want to try. They don't want to plant their flag on, hey, this is the way to evaluate tight ends. This is my method. This is why. If it doesn't work, call me out. But that's what I'm trying to do with this leverage video. So I know it's been 4 minutes of an introduction, but ultimately that's what I'm here to do. I'm here to come up with what I think could be a formula to pick tight ends. So let's start here. First, we have to start with you need to be in a league where tight ends actually matter. And what I mean by that is if you're just in a PPR league or a tight end premium league, 1.5 PPR, tight ends don't matter. I wrote a chapter for the analytics of Dynasty in 2021, and I talked about this. The data has held true through this year as well. You really do not want to flex tight ends, which means basically you're going to have more. Let's say it's a 12-team league. I'll make that the basis for the discussion. If it's a 12-team league, you do not want to flex tight ends if it's PPR or 1.5 premium. The only tight ends you want to flex are the guys that are inside the top 6, 7, 8 at the position. That's less than the number of starters that will be started across the league. So to achieve that doesn't mean you can't flex a tight end. I'm not saying never flex one. What I'm saying is the suboptimal play would be to flex a tight end most of the time unless you have one of the top 8. So I'll leave it at that. If you're going to value tight ends in a PPR league or a 1.5 premium, and this is where only one is required to be started, one strategy you can take advantage of is if you're going to take an early tight end in a startup draft. Let's say you're going to take Mark Andrews or Kyle Pitts or even like TJ Hawkinson, like maybe you're going to take him at tight end 4 or 5 or something like that. Take another one. Try to hit on another top 8 tight end, because what you're doing is you really don't want to flex a tight end outside of that top 8. So if you just kind of roughly estimate, where am I taking my second tight end? If it's not inside like the top 6, 7, 8, it's probably not a good bet to flex. Now, that's not talking about whether that guy's going to produce as a top 8 tight end. What I'm looking at is A, their value, but B, are they going to produce as a top 8 tight end? They might be valued that way, but if they don't produce there, you still don't want to flex them. So the idea being, if you take 2, all you're really doing is taking a shot on maybe hitting on 2 top 8 tight ends, where if you flexed them, they would keep up with a lot of the other flexes, a lot of the other running backs, a lot of the other receivers. What you're also doing, and this is where the strategy comes in, if you're in a start 1 PPR or 1.5 PPR, you take another one basically to crowd out the room, right? Like you take now 2 of what you think is the top 7 or top 8. You've now eliminated another team that's going to be able to match you at the starting spot. So you're going to force another team to start to stream, or another team to have to take more shots later to try to platoon. That's where your advantage is. It's not an advantage to just have, okay, 4 tight ends that are inside the top 20 in a 1.5 PPR start 1. You never want to flex those guys that are tight end 9, 10, 12, 15. You never want to flex those guys. Someone else is going to be beating you in the flex. Shout out Sean Siegel, Rotoviz. They talk about all the time, dominate the flex, win the flex. You don't want to be flexing Gerald Everett. I don't care what the format is. If it's start 1, 1.5 PPR, there can be only 9 starters, 10 starters, 11. You don't want to flex Gerald Everett in that format. So just get that out of the way. If you're listening to this and you only play in PPR leagues and you only play in 1.5 premium leagues, you can listen to this, but just understand always what you're shooting for is literally like a top 8 tight end or better. Otherwise, it really doesn't matter. Otherwise, you can go into a startup and say, you know what? I'm not going to pay for a top 7 or 8 tight end. I'm just going to platoon, which is fine. Just means every week you're going to be trying to guess which tight end's going to get a touchdown, which tight end's going to catch a couple balls, which tight end do you maybe stack with a quarterback. You're trying to find value other ways, but it's not advantageous to draft Irv Smith and Cole Kmet in a startup and say, well, I can just flex Cole Kmet. That's not how it works. That's not optimal to do. So let's get into the formats that matters, and then I'm going to get into the data. I'm going to make the data quick because I said I'm going to keep this around 15 minutes. It'll probably be about 20. So when you start getting into 1.75 PPR or 2 PPR for tight ends, that's when it starts to have a little bit more of an impact. If you just look over the last 5 years, if you look at 1.75 PPR, there's about, you're talking about somewhere around 13 to 14 tight ends optimally that crack the threshold of being able to be flexed. And if you assume 12 of those are going to be in starting lineups, you have a couple others in a 1.75 PPR that you might be able to flex. So it extends that threshold out to like the top 13 or 14 tight ends. So you have a little more leeway to be able to flex one. If you take 2 of the top 14 in a startup, there's a chance that you hit on 2 guys that you can always be flexing one of your tight ends. When you bump it up to 2 PPR, it extends out even more. When you look at 2 PPR, you're talking about around 16 to 17 tight ends that are going to be flex worthy or start worthy. So assume that the top 12 are going to be in the starting lineup. And it doesn't always work this way. Just because the top 12 are these players doesn't mean they're distributed amongst all the other teams evenly. Each team has one. That's not usually how it works. This just gives you a threshold to say, okay, I go into the startup, it's 2 PPR. Even if it's only start 1, I can draft anywhere up to like my top 16 or 17 tight ends with the plan of being able to flex the second one that I take. So it allows you to be a little more flexible, quote unquote flexible, because I'm talking about the flex, but you're able to at least have some leeway with, okay, I'm going to take, Cole Kmet at tight end 13 because he's the best player available. Well, you know what? You can take him knowing you can probably safely flex him if he roughly finishes in that range. That's the difference when you start getting into 175, 2 PPR. Now, when you get into start two, so start two, all it really does is extend the starters out even further. It doesn't change the flex threshold really, because it's still, most start two leagues are still 1.5 PPR. So it's still going to mean that you're going to want to really target, those top 8, 10 tight ends, but the scarcity gets raised up a notch because now everyone has to start two. So if you think about that, the median changes. The median average of what the replacement value at that position changes because you're really looking at your tight end room as I have to start two here. So you're almost looking at the median averages. What is my average across tight end 1 through tight end 24? So you can add the threshold a little bit in start two leagues. So these definitely matter in start two. Where they matter more in start two is finding out which tight ends I want to stash. Because one of the flaws in a start two tight end league that I see is people will hold still too many tight ends. Even if it's start two, 1.5 PPR, I'll see people that hold like 10 tight ends. And it kind of makes sense to hold more just simply so that you don't run out of bodies. But you really only want to start, most likely, 2 of those guys ever. You don't want to flex them. So you almost have to really, really thin that needle really well. You want to have your 2 starters. You probably want to have 3 starters that you can, quote unquote, rely on a weekly basis. But you don't want to overinvest because you're overinvesting into the scarcity. So the only way scarcity brings you value in Dynasty is if you can prey on other owners or other managers that don't have something in that scarce category. So I see people in 2 tight end leagues. Yeah, it might be tight end premium, but it's not enough of a tight end premium to say I want to flex them over running backs or over wide receivers. So you'll see people that'll draft like 6 tight ends inside the top 20 or 25 in ADP, which is the same as hoarding quarterbacks in a 2 QB league. But really, once you hit that mark, you started to go above and beyond your optimal roster construction. Now you might have a lot of value on your roster, but you still have to find trades to do it. So just be careful and understand, hey, I do want to get good tight ends and start two, but really where this data is going to come in is this is the players I want to stash on the back of my roster. Like I'm in a start 2 tight end league where it's 1.5 PPR, but there's 45-man rosters. So I want to know, like I'm going to probably just by default roster like 10 tight ends in that league because there's so many roster spots, but I want to know which ones to pick up. I want to know what I'm looking for from a data perspective when you're in these leagues where they matter. So to recap, 1.75 PPR, 2 PPR, even in start 1, those are the formats where it actually matters, where tight ends could get kicked into the flex. Start 2, really any format, but once you get above like 1.5, it's absolutely hyper. This is where if it's like start 2 tight ends with 2 PPR, you literally want to take them as frequently as you can. Like you're going to almost run out of tight ends that are worth picking up when your roster size runs out. Like you're going to run out of tight ends to pick up before you run out of roster spots, most likely, considering that you're still going to roster some receivers and quarterbacks and running backs. So let's get into the data. So I'm going to talk about, and I'm probably going to end up going like 25 minutes now, but I'm going to talk about 2 things. So what I did is, because we don't have a lot of great analysis, there's so many people out there that are way better than me at picking players. I mean, it's probably not my content, quite honestly. If you followed me for a while, I'm not the guy you're going to go to say, hey, who do I draft? What profile is better? Right? Like I'm not that kind of analyst. I'm a very data-driven process portfolio style analyst. And so I leverage other people that this is all they do. They scout rookies, they watch film, they crunch data. Like that's their specialty. Basically, I just listen to them. I take in as much content. One of the things I pride myself on is, I'm listening to content constantly on 2 to 3x speed. I mean, I try to get through 20 to 40 hours a day of podcast content and NFL content, just cycling through my brain constantly. But I take a lot of data from other people. And a lot of what I take is player evaluation. Hey, a bunch of guys out there I respect, they like this player. or they like this profile, or they like this idea, they like this strategy. Like I take that and try to mold it into my own. So when it comes to players, I'm trying to figure out what players to pick, but I have a lot of resources to go to for running backs. I have a lot of resources to go to for wide receivers, even for quarterbacks. I think for quarterbacks, the analysis is even more lazy, probably because the NFL isn't good at picking quarterbacks either. But I think we have a pretty good baseline to say, like, if you're not a first round pick, or my research has been, if you're not like a top 50 pick, it's very rare you even get a chance to start at quarterback. Like the teams just don't develop you the way that they might if a guy was a late first round pick even. So it's just really hard. So it's just a bad bet to make in a draft, which is why this class was so interesting, because you have good profile quarterbacks that went in the third round. So what was the fine line between like, okay, when do I take them? I know it's not a great bet. I know taking Matt Corral or Desmond Ritter is not a great bet, but at some point there becomes a price to where, hey, if they start even like 3 games, and all it's going to take to start like 3 games is that the team gives them a chance because they have nothing to lose, right? So there's always a price. But I think quarterbacks are pretty easy to evaluate for Dynasty, especially some of the formats we play in. Backups don't really matter until they're starting. So I tend to think you can just follow draft capital when it comes to quarterbacks. But for tight ends, it's all over the map. So I think a lot of analysts don't even bother with tight end because they can't take like draft capital, for instance, and go, okay, here's the order the tight ends were drafted. Perfect. That's a great piece of information for running backs or quarterbacks or wide receivers. Then they can't take, okay, here's the landing spot of where they went, so let's adjust. So you start with the profile, you start with a grade or a film grade or a data grade, whatever your model says, whatever. Then you add in draft capital, then you tweak for landing spot, then you adjust for price. That's pretty much what we do at every other position except for tight end. People don't do that at tight end. They may try, but it's not consistent. You know, they will say, oh, well, I'm going to take this guy over that guy, even though this guy got drafted 2 rounds earlier. Maybe I like this guy because of his landing spot, but then I'm ignoring landing spot over here because of this guy's athleticism. So it's all over the map. So what I found is a lot of analysts just avoid the position and they just default to, well, you know, I don't really play any formats where tight ends matter, or, oh, my league's tight ends don't matter. That's probably because it's a start 1.5 PPR where, yeah, they don't matter unless you have one of the top guys. So I'm going to get into the data. I looked at the last 10 years. I'm trying to find a really easy way to screen out what tight ends I don't want. This doesn't mean it's foolproof. This doesn't mean it's 100%, but I'm looking for a way to just say, okay, I want to simplify the position. Because one negative thing about tight ends is there's a ton of them. Like every team is carrying at least 3 tight ends. A lot of teams will break their 53-man roster after the preseason ends. They'll have 3 tight ends. Some teams will have 4. Some teams have a good tight end prospect that's being developed who moved from another position. Some teams have one on their taxi squad. And it doesn't mean because they're on the taxi squad that they're not actually a good stash for Dynasty. We know the ramp-up period for tight ends in Dynasty is a lot more. It takes a while to learn the position. There's also nuances to the position. I'm not the guy to tell you about that, but I know there are like 2 or 3 different versions of an NFL tight end. So just because a guy says tight end doesn't necessarily mean that their learning curve may not be 3 or 4 years. Then there's others where you're going like, well, that guy's a stiff, but he's playing right away. How is this rookie tight end playing? But this guy's profile that I really like, he's on the taxi squad. You see things like that. So I don't think people have a handle on how to evaluate the position. They can't just say, oh, well, this guy's getting first team reps, so I'm going to move him up. It doesn't work that way. So it's really hard, I think, for the mainstream analysts to evaluate it and have really any clue what they're talking about. And they also don't necessarily have the time nor the data to go, okay, I have a process. So that's what I'm trying to come up with. So I know 19 minutes into the video, I'm starting to finally get into the data, but here it is. I've gone back. I looked at the last decade worth of top 24 tight end finishes. Okay. So I looked at the top 24. I've pared it down. I may do a little bit of a deeper dive on the top 24 a little bit later, but I pared it down to the top 12 because I think that's going to probably address most of the formats we're playing in. Even like the 1.75, 2 PPR leagues, you know, you still aren't going to go much deeper than in terms of like relevant tight ends. You're still not going to go that much deeper on a given yearly basis outside of like the top 20-ish. Okay. But I just looked at the top 12 finishers. So listen to this if you're in a format where tight ends actually matter, and this is where you can find your advantage. So I looked at the last decade worth of tight end 1 finishes. So I looked at 120 seasons over the last decade, what do these guys have in common? Okay. What do the guys that finish inside the top 12 have in common? And I was blown away by the results that actually came out when I looked at this. So I looked at the first thing I looked at was RAS score. Anybody that's not familiar with RAS score, it's relative athletic score. It's exactly what it sounds. It is taking your relative athleticism and it takes into play 10 different components. You can look it up. It's RAS.football. Check out that website. You can look up the RAS score for anybody that has a complete profile. They had to have these 10 things that are encompassed into the profile, but look it up. It's those really, really colorful red, green, yellow charts that you see sometimes shared on Twitter. That's the RAS score. So I just looked at RAS score. That's the first thing because we always hear, well, I want tight ends that are athletic, right? So I looked at RAS score and I was shocked. So out of the 120 tight end finishes over the past decade, only 12 did not have a complete RAS score. So you do have some guys that still don't have a complete RAS score. We don't have some of the testing components or the measurement components for them. So really the sample size for RAS score was only 108. But out of the 108 tight ends that finished in this sample size, and we're looking at RAS score, it was shocking to see that out of the 108, 93 of them, so we're talking 86%, had a RAS score of at least 7.14. That's pretty high. It's on a scale from 0 to 10. So 7.14 was kind of the cutoff. So let's just round it down, and for argument's purposes, let's make it 7. So 86% of these tight ends had a RAS score over 7. Of the 15 that did not, 9 of those 15 had a RAS score over 6.38. So if you add those two together, you're looking at the 9 that were over 6.38 with the 93 that were over 7.14. So you're talking about 94.4% of tight ends had a RAS score of at least 6.38. So if you want to round it down just to capture pretty much the whole sample, you're talking about like a RAS score of like 6. So call it 6, 6.5, whatever. But that's what you're looking for. That's pretty strong. Like almost 95% of tight ends that finish inside the top 12 have a RAS score 6 or above, and call it 6.38. That's the exact number that we're looking at. So that was the first thing. So having that sample size, I then looked at 40 time. Now, 40 time can be a bit subjective. Sometimes they'll use adjusted 40 times. Sometimes you'll see people quote pro days and then they'll adjust them. Obviously, there's different tracks. I know we heard this year with the combine, the track was really fast. So what does the combine pro days or combine 40 times mean this year compared to the past? But the 40 time is something that I looked at secondary. So 40 time is part of the RAS score. So in a way, you're double counting this. However, one thing I noticed is when you start to separate these out, and I'll talk about that in a second, you start to see a pattern on the guys that maybe have the RAS score, but not the 40 time or vice versa. So I looked at these 120 tight end finishes, and then I looked at their 40 time. Now, of the group, 99 out of 120, 82.5%, had a 40 time of 4.72 or less. So 4.72 seconds or better. Of the 21 who did not, of the 21 that were above 4.72, 9 of those 21 were still under 4.8. So if you just take that, you're coming up with a magic mark. Over 93% of tight ends that finished as a tight end 1 had a 40 time under 4.8. So if you just take those two data points right there, you're over 93% on both the RAS score and the 40 time. So a RAS score over 6.38 and a 40 time under 4.8. So you take those two things together and you say, okay, I'm probably coming up with a pretty strong sample size. Like that's my first thing that I look at when I go, do I want to stash a tight end? I'm looking for that. I'm almost making my list of tight ends before I look at anything else, before I look at draft capital, before I look at their landing spot, their age, their college production, anything like that. I'm almost just filtering for those two things. If you don't have those two things, then you're going to be over in the like to be determined, need to convince me category. So if you really just wanted to say, okay, I don't really need to go super deep in evaluating tight ends, I'm just going to take Scott's rule. I need a RAS over 6.38 and I need a 40 time under 4.8. And if you don't have that, I'm just going to pass you over. Let somebody else put you on a roster. So looking at those two things and then combining it. So I just wanted to look at the players that were the outliers, right? So I took the group of the ones that were under a 4.8, okay? And then also posted a RAS score over 6.38. Now, some of those, again, the RAS score was unavailable. But of those categories, remember I talked about the 94% with the RAS score and the 93% with the 40? 91% of that sample size were overlapping. So basically, of those two samples, the 94% group and the 93% group, 91% were overlapping. Basically, so they did both. So that's really predictive. We're talking about over 91%. If you just take this criteria, it's pretty predictive if you just look at the past 10 years. So that's pretty cool to see. Like, I can just look at these two things, and that really helps me evaluate tight end. Now, I did want to learn from the outliers. And I apologize, I'm over 25 minutes. It's going to be 30. I always say, hey, it's going to be less, and then it ends up going more. But I want to talk about the outliers. So who are the outliers? Like, you're going to sit here and you're going to probably tell me, well, Scott, I'm looking through some tight ends, playing with RAS score, looking at their 40 times. I see some outliers. I see some outliers that have produced in the past, right? Yeah, so I wanted to look at who are the guys that did not hit these marks, but still produced as top 12 tight ends. So there's a couple names that stick out. Hunter Henry. He has 3 tight end 1 seasons. He has a RAS score below 6.38. Jordan Reed, 4 top 12 seasons. He also has a RAS score below 6.38. Remember, I talked about the guys that didn't produce without the RAS. So that's 7 of those seasons right there. However, one thing to keep in mind with those two guys, Hunter Henry ran a 4.68 40. Jordan Reed ran a 4.72 40. So again, even the outlier seasons, they still did one or the other. Like, those are one of the guys that will, their sample size will overlap. So that's something important to look at, is the ones that didn't do it, the ones that didn't check both of these boxes, they didn't check neither of the boxes, if that makes sense. Now, looking at top 12 tight end production without the 4.8 40, that's something that's extremely rare. You do not see that. Only 5 top 12 seasons were posted with a 40 time below 4.8. 4 of those 5 were Kyle Rudolph. Now, Kyle Rudolph, what did Kyle Rudolph had? Kyle Rudolph had a RAS score of 7.76. So yeah, Kyle Rudolph was slow. If you look back at Kyle Rudolph's 40, it was 4.83. So he's outside the sample. But he still had a RAS score of 7.76. So again, as you're seeing, the guys that are outliers that were picked out of this group that didn't check both boxes, they still generally checked one box. They checked one or the other. So almost, if you look at this, okay, you may not have a big enough sample size for your given league. If you're like in a start 2 tight end with 2 PPR and 40 roster spots, like, you're going to have to roster a lot of different players. And it does make sense to carry some extra tight ends. However, if you're just looking for low hanging fruit and you're just looking for, trying to find some stash tight ends, one thing I can say, in this sample, there has never been a tight end that has produced at a top 12 season without at least one of those criteria. So we're talking about without the 4.72 RAS score, or the sub 40, the sub 4.8 40 time, and the 6.38 RAS score. Nobody has done that. Where they've been outside of both of them, they've never posted a top 12 tight end season in the last decade. So something to think about. So takeaways. Ultimately, my takeaway from this was there are a couple tight ends out there that I do not want. And why do I not want them? Because they don't fit either one of these criteria. So if you're going to take away one thing, if you're still listening to this video at almost 30 minutes in, Irv Smith, sell. Harrison Bryant, sell. Brevin Jordan, sell. Do not add Isaiah Likely, Trey McKitty, or Jalen Weidermeyer onto your dynasty team. Those are examples of 6 players that do not check these boxes. So if you want to play the odds, trade the guys that have some value. Don't roster the guys that don't have any value on that list. But play this. Look at this stuff. If you're in a league where tight end matters, I'm going to be using this as my evaluation. So maybe I'm giving away a little bit of my secret, but I don't think there's a lot to go on in terms of valuing tight ends. It's a lot of, well, let me look up this player. Let me see if I want him. And that's it. So with that, I'll go ahead and sign off. Hopefully you stuck with me with this video. I know it's a little bit in the weeds and not everyone may be interested in tight ends, but hopefully it helps. those that are in these leagues where tight ends actually do matter. Shout out to Clay for the platform. At Trades in 5 is our YouTube show where we do that with Clay, myself, and Shane Manila, talking trades, strategy, players, pretty much anything that anybody requests that we do. Dynasty Pandemic, check out the app, dynastypandemic.com. And of course, you can find me on Twitter at CharlesChillFFB, hashtag Dynasty Leverage, and my regular podcast, which is Dynasty and Chill. Click the link below to subscribe in Apple Podcasts. With that, I'll go ahead and sign off. Until the next Dynasty Leverage episode, be chill.